He's not right.
Madrid, 1661. The palace corridors hold their breath. Outside the queen's birthing chamber, the scent of burning incense can't mask the stench of dread. Nobles fidget. Servants whisper like blades in the dark. Behind thick oak doors, a scream tears through the silence. A queen in labor, a nation in suspense. Then nothing. The door creaks open. A midwife steps out, blood on her hands, ashen face. No announcement, no joy. Only 5 words, barely above a whisper. There's something wrong with him. Inside, Queen Mariana lies motionless. And beside her, wrapped in gold-threaded silk, is Spain's future, Charles II. But something is wrong. Everyone sees it. No one says it. His jaw juts grotesquely. His tongue spills from his mouth. His limbs dangle like broken marionette strings. He does not cry. He cannot nurse. And yet they bow. They cheer. Because he is royal. Because he is a Habsburg. But in truth, he is a prophecy in flesh, a fragile, twisted warning of what happens when bloodlines are worshipped more than wisdom, when a dynasty falls in love with its own reflection. This is not just the birth of a king. This is the beginning of the end. The moment he was born, the midwives knew something was wrong. The child didn't cry. He didn't move. His limbs were limp, his skin a sickly gray. And when they finally got a sound from him, it was less a wail than a wet, gurgling cough. The court physicians scrambled to reassure the royal family. They said he was just weak, that he'd grow strong with time, that miracles happened in royal household. But no miracle was coming. The child was not simply ill. He was the culmination of every bad decision made by generations of monarchs who believed themselves above the laws of nature. A genetic dead and given a crown. And yet they called him His Catholic Majesty. They clothed him in man. They draped him in jewels. They celebrated his birth as if he were the salvation of Spain. In truth, he was a curse-given flesh. A boy who could barely swallow, whose tongue was too large for his mouth, whose bones didn't harden properly. And yet, the kingdom would shape itself around him, deny what was plain to see, and elevate him onto a throne his body was never meant to bear. Because the empire needed a king, and Charles, broken or not, was the only heir they had. They called him Charles II, King of Spain, defender of the Catholic faith, ruler of the vast Spanish Empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. But behind the titles, behind the gold-threaded garments and the ceremonial sword, stood a boy who could barely stand at all. From the moment Charles entered the world, his body betrayed him. He was born with a head far too large for his frail frame, a misshapen skull that pulsed unnaturally under candlelight. His tongue was so swollen he could hardly close his mouth, let alone speak. As an infant, he couldn't nurse. As a child, he couldn't chew. He would gag on bread, choke on meat, drool constantly. His nurses had to mop his chin with cloths day and night. His first teeth didn't come until he was nearly 4. He didn't walk until after 5. And when he finally did, it was with a shambling, uncertain gait that made courtiers turn away, ashamed to look directly at their king. Yet the empire clapped and smiled, pretending everything was fine, because to admit that something was wrong with Charles meant admitting that something was wrong with the entire house of Habsburg. So they lied. They dressed up failure in brioche. They called his silences contemplative, not symptomatic. They said his delays were signs of divine mystery, not brain damage. Behind palace walls, however, reality bled through the illusion. Privately, his tutors despaired. He could not read or write with any fluency. He was described as mentally slow, incapable of concentration, disturbed by loud noises and bright lights. He would stare for hours at flickering candles or trace the embroidery on his robes as if they were maps to another world. When spoken to, he rarely responded. When corrected, he would pout like a toddler. There were times he became inexplicably violent, slapping servants, tearing at his own clothing, chewing at the corners of furniture. One ambassador reported, "The king seems more like a creature preserved by divine accident than a ruler ordained by God." Another simply wrote, "He is not long for this world." And yet Charles lived, not out of strength, but out of sheer, grim inertia. His survival became a kind of political performance, a grotesque endurance act. His mother, Queen Mariana, ruled in his place. She whispered orders behind closed doors, signed decrees in his name, used her son's broken body as a shield behind which she wielded real power. Every time Charles was paraded before the public, slumped in his golden litter, eyes glassy, head lolling to the side, the people were reminded the king still lived. And if he lived, then the empire lived, even if both were already rotting from within. At court, the atmosphere turned funereal. Ministers spoke in hushed voices. Priests hovered constantly, as if waiting for a death that never came. Charles was kept in rooms, scented with incense to mask the odor of his infections. His bed linens were changed twice a day, because he could not control his bowels. And still portraits were painted flattering radiant lies. They gave him strong cheekbones, confident eyes, the hint of a smile. They erased the slack jaw, the sunken gaze, the twitching lips that revealed the truth. The king was crumbling, but he had to be presented. He had to be believed in because there was ninth toss for no one else. The dynasty had bet everything on this one fragile boy. They needed him to survive, to marry, to produce an heir. Even as his bones softened and his mind unraveled, the court continued to whisper plans for his future. The king will marry a French princess. They will sire sons. The line will continue. But deep down they all knew Charles wasn't going to save the dynasty. He was its punishment. And as he grew older, the line between man and marionette blurred. He was dressed, positioned, presented, but he was never truly there. He sat on the throne like a ghost made of flesh, vacant, gurgling, trembling. They crowned him with gold, but the crown sat heavy on a head that had never finished forming. The court knew how to lie. It had been doing it for centuries, but never had the performance been so grotesque, so fragile, so terrifyingly absurd as it became under Charles II. They weren't just lying to the people. They were lying to themselves, because the truth was unbearable. The boy they'd crowned was not a king. He was a collapsing body with a royal title, and the empire itself had become a stage designed to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. The halls of Elis Goriel glittered with candle light and silence. Courtiers spoke in measured tones, always smiling, always bowing, always pretending. Every servant, every minister, every ambassador became a player in a theater of denial. If the king stared blankly through them, he was just deep in thought. If he babbled incoherently during a council meeting, it was merely his unique style of governance. If he failed to respond at all, they nodded solemnly and interpreted his silence as wisdom. The portrait painters became complicit. They crafted images of Charles II that bordered on fantasy. Healthy, poised, regal. They trimmed his jawline, softened the slope of his forehead, straightened the hunched shoulders. In paint, he looked like a monarch. In flesh, he looked like a dying man dressed for his own funeral. Foreign dignitaries came to court expecting majesty. What they found instead was a parade of theater masks. One French envoy wrote home, "I do not know what horrifies me more, the king or the way they pretend he is well." There were banquets held in his honor, where Charles sat drooling into his goblet, unable to lift a spoon. Musicians played for him as he blinked vacantly into space. A court dwarf once slipped during a performance and accidentally said aloud what no one dared. "This is a kingdom ruled by a corpse." The man disappeared by morning. But it wasn't just the king who was disintegrating. It was the entire fabric of royal governance. Ministries fell into infighting. Nobles jockeyed for access to the regent queen, who wielded power behind the veil of motherhood. Religious fanatics saw Charles as proof of divine punishment and began infiltrating court life. Priests whispered of exorcisms. Nobles traded rumors of curses. When crops failed or storms battered the coasts, the blame fell on the king's unnatural condition. Some believed he was bewitched. Others believed he was the witch. And all the while, Charles remained in the center of it, a silent sun in a dying solar system. His days were structured down to the minute, not out of duty, but out of fear. If he was left alone too long, he might harm himself. If he was made to walk too far, he might collapse. If he was told the truth, he might scream. The Queen Mother, Mariana, maintained a tight grip. She controlled who could speak to him, who could touch him, who could see him in his most vulnerable moments. She edited his correspondence, forged his decisions, read his thoughts aloud when he could not speak. He was a puppet, and she was the puppeteer, desperate to maintain the illusion of control as the empire unraveled behind her. In the palace chapel, prayers echoed endlessly. Priests chanted for the king's health, for his mind, for his seed. Because despite everything, despite his drooling, despite his seizures, despite his inability to complete a full sentence, the court was preparing for marriage. They still believed, or pretended to believe, that Charles could produce an heir, that this bloodline, so poisoned, so broken, could still be stretched one generation further. But as foreign suitors arrived, they saw the truth. One French princess, upon meeting Charles for the first time, reportedly fainted. Another refused to remove her gloves, fearing contagion from the very air around. And yet the court kept clapping, kept bowing, kept smiling, because to admit the truth would mean unraveling the entire empire. So they did what they had always done. They pointed to the crown. They kissed his ring and they said, "Long live the king." Even as his mind unraveled, even as his body broke, even as Spain began to die with him. By the time Charles turned 20, the whispers had grown into thunder. They called him the bewitched king, El Hazardo, as if his afflictions could be blamed on dark magic instead of centuries of inbreeding. His body was failing faster than his courtiers could cover it up. His jaw sagged open most days, a string of drool threading down his chin. His hair fell in clumps. His skin took on a waxy yellow hue, like a candle left too close to the flame. His eyes, once merely vacant, now seemed haunted, twitching in their sockets as though they were searching for a way out of the skull that trapped them. And still he ruled. Still he sat on the throne. This massive decay wrapped in velvet and crowned with gold. Marriage became the court's next great fiction. They needed an heir, needed to prove that the broken body in the palace could somehow continue the bloodline. So they chose a bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece to Louis XIV of France. A girl of 17, vivacious, terrified, and utterly unprepared for the world she was about to enter. On her wedding night, she was led to the royal bedchamber like a sacrifice. Charles lay waiting, naked, trembling, confused. What happened in that room became legend. Some say he wept. Some say he prayed. Some say he simply stared at her, unsure what to do until attendants was summoned to explain. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. No child was conceived. Not that night, not ever. Doctors were brought in. Remedies were prepared. Potions were administered. Spanish fly, ground pearls, even powdered deer penis. Priests chanted, surgeons inspected. But there was no remedy for what had been passed down to Charles through generations of incest. He was sterile, his body incapable of producing life. The queen withered beside him. She stopped eating, stopped smiling, and before long she was dead at. Officially of intestinal obstruction, unofficially of despair. The court buried her with pageantry. Charles wailed at her coffin, tearing his hair out in tufts. He asked to sleep beside her corpse. He said she would come back. Within a year, they found him another wife. This time it was Maria Anna of Neuburg. Strong-willed, politically sharp German. She arrived with an army of priests and a team of midwives. Her one mission was to bear a child, but the result was the same. Months of ritual, silence, humiliation, and no heir. She too began to rot from the inside, drained by the role she had been forced to play. Charles aged like spoiled fruit. By 30, he looked 70. His bones bent, his teeth fell out. He could no longer chew. Food was pured, spooned into his mouth by servants who whispered prayers as they fed him. He soiled himself regularly, couldn't climb stairs, couldn't read, couldn't remember. But the crown still sat on his head, and so the court turned to superstition. Physicians were discarded in favor of exorcists. They stripped Charles naked, poured holy water over his body, chanted at him in Latin. They burned herbs beneath his bed, and demanded he confess to sins he did not understand. At one point, a priest declared that the king had been cursed by a Moorish sorcerer as punishment for his ancestors' sins. No one mentioned chromosomes. No one dared whisper the truth, that this was the natural endpoint of a family that had refused to mix blood with outsiders for 200 years. Charles was not bewitched. He was the Habsburg legacy incarnate, a living warning in silk robes. And yet he remained on the throne in the palace at the center of the dying empire. His every breath was treated like a miracle. His every twitch interpreted as divine, because if Charles died, Spain would collapse. There was no plan B, no successor, no son. So they embalmed his failure in ritual. They held him up like a relic, a sacred corpse that still breathed. They shielded him from mirrors, hid his reflection, spoke to him in gentle tones, told him he was chosen, anointed, beloved, and Charles, vacant and withering, believed it, or at least pretended to, because when the lies are all you've known, truth feels like the real horror. By the time Charles turned 30, it was clear he was dying, but no one knew how long it would take. His body had been rotting in slow motion since the day he was born, yet it clung to life with the same desperate inertia that held the Spanish Empire together. Decaying but not yet dead, the court, meanwhile, had turned into a battlefield of whispers. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who would inherit the throne when Charles finally stopped breathing because there were no children, no heirs? His marriage to Marie-Louise had produced nothing but sorrow. And after a sudden death, possibly from cancer, possibly from poison, depending on who you believed, Charles had been forced to remarry. His new queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen for one reason only. Her family was famous for producing many sons, but even that miracle bloodline could not resurrect what had already been doomed. Charles remained childless. His seed was as lifeless as the empire he ruled. They turned again to priests, to relics, to exorcists. The queen even demanded Charles undergo a spiritual investigation to determine whether he had been cursed. They brought in monks and mystics who examined his body, his bedclothes, even the ashes of his late wife. One report claimed his condition had been caused by sorcery fed by poisoned chocolate. Another claimed Satan himself was roosting in the royal bedchamber. And Charles believed it. Of course he did. He had lived his whole life in a dream, a carefully stage-managed illusion of kingship. Now, as his organs failed and his mind dissolved into fog, he clung to superstition like a drowning man clings to driftwood. He begged holy men to cleanse his body. He slept with holy water beneath his pillow. He wore amulets around his neck to keep demons away. But nothing helped. The truth was simpler and far more horrifying. This was not the work of witches or devils. This was the final consequence of incest, of blood turned toxic through generations of arrogance. Charles was not cursed. He was the curse. He began to rot from the inside. His skin took on a yellow pallor. His legs swelled grotesquely. He could no longer digest food. His teeth loosened and fell out. His hair came out in clumps. When he defecated, it came black as tar, laced with blood. His eyes clouded with cataracts. And through it all, he remained on the throne, his broken body propped up like a sacred relic that no one dared discard. Every morning, attendants dressed him in velvet robes. They combed what hair remained. They fitted the crown upon his trembling head and placed him before the court, where he sat like a wax figure melting in the sun. His mind wandered. He mistook strangers for family members. He spoke in circles. He stared into corners and whispered to people no one else could see. And yet, despite the decay, despite the collapsing empire around him, no one dared move against him because there was still no successor. The line of Habsburgs in Spain had run out. The king was dying, and with him, a dynasty that had ruled Europe for centuries. In desperation, Charles dictated a will. But even that document was disputed, manipulated by courtiers, revised by foreign agents, and rewritten by priests. France and Austria circled like vultures, each with their own puppet claimant. War was inevitable. Everyone could feel it coming. But for now, all they could do was wait. Wait for the final breath of a king who had lived too long and suffered too. When he finally died in 1700, Charles was 38 years old. But his body was so destroyed that his autopsy shocked even the most jaded physicians. His heart was black. His lungs were filled with fluid. His intestines were gangrenous. His testicles, they reported, were atrophied and decayed. His body weighed barely 100 pounds, and his blood, His cursed royal blood had turned thick as oil. There were no sons to bury him, no heirs to inherit his broken crown, only the sound of bells echoing across a grieving empire, only a silence that felt too vast to fill. With Charles II, the Spanish Habsburgs died, and in their place, a war ignited, a war that would engulf Europe, redraw borders, and reshape the world. Because when kings forget they are mortal, empires pay the price. The last breath came in silence. Charles lay beneath heavy velvet sheets in the darkened royal chamber, surrounded by relics and incense, the air thick with candle smoke and whispered prayers. His eyes had stopped focusing days ago. His lips moved only to mutter nonsense, snatches of childhood, broken Latin, the names of Baghdad sisters. And still they clung to him. The courtiers, the priests, the queen, all watching a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. The man they had crowned in hope now died in fear, not of death itself. He had been dying since birth, but of what it meant to die as the final link in a chain forged over centuries. The end of a bloodline that had once ruled half the known world. His name was Charles, but he could have been called extinction. There was no glory in it, no royal last words, no candle-lit wisdom passed on to heirs. Only decay. The body collapsed inward. The skin turned waxing. The breath rasped and choked and stopped. And when it did, no one cried out. They simply bowed their heads as if they had rehearsed this moment for years. Because they had. The death was not just of a king, but of a symbol of emperor, of divine right, of the idea that power could be passed like a family heirloom, untouched by consequence. But Charles II had proven the lie of that illusion. He had been the mirror held up to monarchy, a reflection too grotesque to deny. And in his death, the lie crumbled. The bells of Madrid rang for hours. Across Spain, mourning was ordered by royal decree. But the people had little left to give. Famine had already stolen their strength. Taxes had stolen their futures. The death of the king was not a tragedy. It was a long-awaited exhale, an end to the waiting, an end to the illusion that things could go on as they were. Across Europe, embassies erupted. The French and Austrian dynasties, both with blood claims to the throne, mobilized armies before the body was even cold. Within weeks, Spain was no longer a sovereign empire. It was a chessboard. And Charles, just a pawn long fallen, finally swept from the table. The War of the Spanish Succession would last over a decade, killing hundreds of thousands, drawing in every major European power, and leaving the empire shattered. The Americas would rebel. The treasury would empty. The world would move on. But somewhere beneath the marble floors of Les Scorel, in a tomb more elaborate than a man like Charles ever deserved, his bones still lie, blackened, crumbling, sealed in gold. He ruled for nearly 4 decades. Yet he left nothing. No heirs, no victories, no legacy but caution. His life and his death remind us what happens when power becomes an inheritance rather than a responsibility. When bloodlines matter more than merit. When rulers believe themselves gods and forget that gods too in the end can bleed. Charles of Akin did not lose his empire. He was the loss. History remembers kings by their victories, their conquests, their golden statues and gilded tombs. But Charles II left behind no triumph, no monuments worth visiting, only a warning carved in bone. His reign wasn't marked by what he did, but by what he was. A man so consumed by the very bloodline that crowned him, he became its final echo. He was the end of a story that had gone on too long. A dynasty so obsessed with purity, it bred itself into extinction. And in Charles, that madness took shape. A body twisted by centuries of arrogance. A mind broken by generations of whispered entitlement. But he wasn't born evil. He wasn't a tyrant. He was the consequence. A living artifact of a system that believed power could be passed like jewelry regardless of the cost. He bore the weight of that mistake with every step, every seizure, every drooling ceremony in a palace that had become a mausoleum. What makes his story terrifying isn't just the grotesque decay of his body. It's how long the world kept pretending everything was fine. The silence, the complicity, the gold-trimmed theater that surrounded his suffering. Because no one wanted to admit that the system itself had failed. Charles II didn't destroy the empire. The empire destroyed itself, and used him to do it. And that's the true horror. Not madness, not disease, but a machine that kept running long after it should have stopped, fueled by superstition, vanity, and blood, until the last king of Spain's greatest dynasty sat drooling on a throne, while the world collapsed around him, and no one dared speak the truth. This wasn't just the death of a monarch. It was what happens when power devours itself.